So what I want to share with you all today is I'm with the Center for Inclusion. Once I figure out this PowerPoint, there it is. So we're a national policy advocacy organization. We work out of New York City, but we work all over the country. And actually, a lot of our work is really concentrated in the South, particularly in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, because of how a lot of the issues really show up very stark in Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, although across the Deep South. But also because a lot of national organizations, we recognize the need for investment in really social justice infrastructure in the South. And so that's a lot of the work that we do is in the South. We do our work, again, we're a policy advocacy organization with the goal of building opportunity by dismantling structural racism. And so that's the lens that I'm going to share with you all today, is really, we all know in this work that race plays a role, but how does it play a role and how can we use it as both a lens to understand what the root problems are for communities of color, but also all communities, and then how do we use it as a tool to really change the way that a lot of the disparities are showing up, which have been highlighted in many of the presentations earlier today and yesterday. So we do this in three ways. One is ideas. We think about what are the policies that really get at the roots of the structural issues that we're seeing. Two is leadership. We understand that we as a national organization cannot push this stuff alone, that it's important that it comes from people in communities that are connected to the issues. And oftentimes our communities are the ones that are with the least resources and the least capacity to really push on policymakers. And three, around communications. How do we talk about race in a productive way that really pushes conversations around progressive policy forward? So what I'm going to share with you all today is this. And I'm sorry, but the presentation is actually not in the books, but I will make it available. B is going to have it. And so all the information that's going to be in here, you all will be able to access later. So what is structural racism? Does anybody know? Oh, I see some head nods. So. Well, so the way we think about structural racism is a lot of times when people hear the word racism, they think, well, there's a bad actor. It's intentional discrimination. Someone is a bigot. Someone doesn't like a person of another color. But something that I want to share with you all is this concept of structural racism, which is really that sometimes our public institutions, because of the way that we make policy decisions, create systems of opportunity and barriers to opportunities. And oftentimes the way these operate impact communities of color across race very differently. And it doesn't necessarily need bad intent for bad impacts to happen across race. And so if we can really understand that, then we have to know that when we look at public policy, we don't have to necessarily see a racist clause to think that it's racist. But if the impacts across race are different, then we need to be proactive about fashioning policy solutions that really take that into account. And I'm going to give you all some real tangible examples of how that's manifested throughout our history and how what policy decisions we've made as a country to create opportunities and create barriers to opportunities, but also how this is manifesting in today's economic crisis, the stimulus package, implementation, all that. So why we need to deal with race head-on. I think, it can be a challenge sometimes for those of us in communities really trying to push on progressive policy to really talk about race, because oftentimes people think of it as the third rail. We can't talk about that. If we bring up race, then it's going to become a divisive conversation. Then people start thinking, oh, it's us versus them. But something I want to share with you all is there are really tangible reasons why we need to talk about it proactively in order to really create solutions that get at the root of problems all of our communities are facing. One is that people of color are often the miner's canary, signaling where we need to focus and create solutions. So I'm sure you all are familiar with the miner's canary analogy. No? Are there folks that are familiar with it? Okay, I want to pick on somebody that raised their hand and share what is the miner's canary? Yes. Yes. So miners, did everybody hear that? So miners used to bring in a canary, and they knew that the poisonous air was in the air and that they needed to get out once they saw the canary die. And oftentimes, this is how communities of color are positioned in our society. Hurricane Katrina is a very, very glaring example, although there are many, many others, where we see that when we have not invested adequately in our public infrastructures, whether they be hard infrastructures like levees or softer infrastructures like schools, transportation systems to get to jobs, those are systems that not only impact communities of color, although we see those things very starkly in those communities, they hurt everybody. If we don't have levee systems that adequately protect all communities, then all of us get hurt, you know? And same thing can be said for the current economy. We built an economy on shaky ground by allowing predatory lending practices that really were targeted towards communities of color because of the history of disinvestment in communities of color that ended up getting targeted to white communities as well. And had we known and attacked that from the onset and cared about those issues as they affected communities of color, our entire economy would be much better off today. Thank you. So, second reason, communities of color must be part of the fight for different policies because of how they are impacted and because of the changing demographics. I think it was Dr. Sanchez yesterday who shared that in Texas, in the very near future, it's going to be over 50% Latino. And the same is true for the country as a whole. So given that this positions us nationally and here in the state in a different position to really create coalitions in communities around what solutions really can impact all of us, we need to think proactively about what fights are happening in communities of color that can help to create more of a progressive coalition for everybody. And the third reason is that race is often used as a wedge in policy debates that impact everyone. And so a very tangible example of that is in today's healthcare debate. So I don't know if all of you know this, but in 1946, Harry Truman actually tried to pass universal health care. That was a long time ago. We're still working on this, right? And who knows how it's going to turn out this time. But in 1946, basically Harry Truman, it was a time in which many developed countries across the world were starting to institute their universal health care policies, including England, Canada, France, other places. And Harry Truman recognized that this was the last piece of New Deal policies that had not been instituted in the country. And so in an attempt to pass universal health care, one thing that was very important to do was to create a coalition of legislators, including those in the South. Well, a lot of the legislators in the South that did not get behind the health care bill was precisely because it would mean that they would have to integrate the hospital systems, and they were not willing to do that. Even though the largest percentage of white folks that stood to benefit because they tended to be poorer were in the South. So this is a perfect example of how race can be used as a wedge, and that does not only impact communities of color, but it impacts everybody because of the way that it creates divides. And we can see that parallel in today's healthcare debate around the immigration bill, or I'm sorry, around the healthcare bill. A lot of folks claimed that Obama and a lot of these Democratic leaders were trying to use healthcare to benefit immigrants, quote unquote, illegal immigrants that were just sucking from the system, quote unquote. And that's a perfect example of how many people were using race, because immigration is a code word for Latino, as a way to create a wedge to pass this large, sweeping public policy that really many people, including white middle-class Americans who are going bankrupt from this issue, would benefit from. So one thing we often hear that, you know what, yes, I care about race, it's important, I see how it manifests in our public policy discussions, but really, isn't it really just about class? Because if we just took care of poverty, wouldn't that inadvertently take care of race? No. I'm going to offer to you all that it's really important that we think about race and class when we think about policy solutions. Class is very